Glow Part 2 is an indie folk album by The Microphones. The Microphones is a band whose only member is Phil Elverum, who has released most of his music under the name of Mount Eerie. He's an extremely passionate, talented, imaginative creator, and my favorite musical artist of the 21st century by far, as well as just one of my favorite people. He comes off as very down-to-earth and wise in his interviews, and I highly recommend you check out all his stuff, not just this one, although we will be focusing mostly on this album. The album we're focusing on, The Glow Part 2, is much more experimental and eclectic than his previous work, and displays influence from everything from black metal to avant-garde music to industrial music during its 66-minute runtime, which I find to be the perfect length for what the album is. The lyrics heavily reference nature and seem to draw from an endless pool of mysterious poetic metaphors and melancholic ruminations. The sound of the album is very lo-fi and rustic, but the whole project has this sort of special atmosphere to it. You can hear the buzzing of amps, the reverberation of the recording studio, and the details are so carefully captured and thoughtfully arranged. The scope of this album is monumental, and the ambition, not to mention the amount of effort needed to craft something this huge and dense with fleshed out ideas. It must have been monumentally difficult to make, and he was in his early 20s when he released this album all by himself. If you're unaware, Mount Eerie's recording techniques are very unique. The album was recorded on a 16-track analog tape in order to create a more organic sound. He would record most of the tracks alone, and handled the production of the album entirely by himself. He used dynamic range compression techniques in order to get the sound he wanted, but effects pedals were not enough for this man. In order to create the guitar distortion, which plays an important role in the album, he, quote, ran the guitar through a mic input on a cassette deck and out of the headphone jack into an amp. The album also makes heavy use of multi-tracking, especially on songs that feature two recordings of acoustic guitars layered over one another, which is a staple of this record's sound. The opening track has always been one of my favorites, and it's always the song I choose to introduce people to the Microphones in Mount Eerie. It's one of the more straightforward songs on the album, not too long and not too noisy or strange, so it serves as an easy introduction to the album for new listeners. The lyrics speak of a sort of aversion to the woes of modern city life, and it really feels like the beginning stages of what is to be a grand adventure. Phil sings about thunderclouds, rain, the sun, and other natural elements. It sets up the themes of loss, nature, alienation, and I think more than anything, the song sounds like a call to adventure, like at the beginning of the archetypal hero's journey template. The dual acoustic guitars are a really great feature of this song, but where I really think this one shines is near the end, where the track seems to be fading out at first, only to come back but heavily distorted and played at a much higher volume. This part transitions into the title track, The Glow Part 2, which is a sequel to the 11-minute long song The Glow from his previous album It Was Hot, We Stayed in the Water. It instantly hits you with shrieking guitars that give way to vocals that almost make this sound like a Midwest emo song.
I took my shirt off in the yard.
Phil's voice has a very meek quality to it. He sounds like a mouse fighting to be heard over the roaring of the instruments. His delivery is kind of wavery and weak, like he's about to choke on his own tears. And while he's not the most technically proficient singer, I adore his delivery. The lyrics turn very introspective, with lines like the raw, "My blood flows harshly," and "I cannot get through September without a battle" being some of my favorites. It ends really strong, with the song being gently carried away with some satisfying finger-picking. According to Phil, the song is about wanting to curl up into a ball and die, basically, and being almost annoyed at the realization that you're still alive and breathing. The third track, The Moon, is a fan favorite, and really leans on the dual acoustic guitars I was talking about earlier, especially in the lengthy intro. This one is insanely noisy, to a point where it's almost impossible to make out the lyrics, but it's not a painful kind of noise, it's almost soft in tone. This song is of a particularly narrative quality. It's about visiting places he used to go with his ex in an attempt to forget, which fails to work. Headless Horseman might be my favorite song on the album. I can't tell you how many times I've cried to this. It's about a particularly volatile breakup, with lyrics describing an encounter where blows and harsh words are traded. This one is only guitar and vocals, and the simpler sound space shines a light on Phil's excellent songwriting abilities. Lyrics like "You turn me into a stray dog from a mighty human man" almost evoke a sense of natural mysticism, imbuing some fantastical elements, however metaphorical, into the world of the album. At the end of the track, you can hear the first example of this album's most notable motif, a foghorn, which you'll hear many more times throughout the record. I found a Reddit thread that seems to shed some light on the Foghorns with a quote from an interview done with Mount Eerie. So yeah, the Foghorns on the Glow Part 2 were inspired by Twin Peaks, as was this album as a whole. Just a little fact for you. Another commenter pointed out that Phil's hometown of Anacortes is home to Seaside Ports, so he might have recorded the sound of a foghorn there, but another commenter, referring to an interview I haven't read, said that before Phil had mentioned the sound was just a distorted bass. The fifth track, My Roots Are Strong and Deep, is strikingly different sounding and features a heavily distorted piano. Elverum compares himself to a tree that is growing, and he wants to reach out to something or someone much larger and more significant than him, but isn't able to. This larger thing could be his ex, who has occupied all his thoughts since the beginning of the album, or he could be singing about wanting to connect with nature or the universe. The sound of this is very heavy and full. Being recorded in a lo-fi manner, a lot of music can unfortunately end up sounding thin, with almost no body or weight to speak of. On the contrary, this album sounds hefty, substantial in your ears, and if you're playing it on a speaker, it fills up your room and reverberates thickly. The sixth instrumental track gives us a short break to settle down and recuperate after the intense, emotionally taxing last 5 songs, because this album hits hard and only lets up at these sort of checkpoints, goalposts it places for you, like trail markers on the trail. And you're going to need that break because the next track, The Mansion, is one of the most depressing songs you are going to hear in your lifetime. The dual guitars fade in and pan on each side of your ears. This is one of those songs that really takes advantage of stereo sound to immerse the listener and build atmosphere. A minute and a half deep, Phil's lethargic delivery accompanies depressive lyrics about what there is and what there isn't. There's no end, no glory, just a slow, resounding story. This song is particularly poetic, and while it's one of the slower, quieter songs, it was at one point my favorite. I've had individual obsessions with most of the songs on this project. Instrumental is an instrumental interlude, a good one. There's a second interlude track that follows up this one that almost sounds like something out of a Silent Hill game. Very industrial, very spooky. Sounds like machines that have been possessed by ghosts. I love noise, so I love tracks like this. I never skip any of the tracks. I find that each one on this record serves as an essential part of the album, and that it would be devastating if any of them were removed. I'll Not Contain You was my favorite song off this album when I was working in a prison kitchen in 2020, in the midst of healing after getting out of a toxic relationship. Being a breakup album, this song describes the process of giving one's ex distance. The sound of it is very solemn, but not quite as crushingly dark as The Mansion. The dual guitars are played very loosely and intersect in interesting ways as heavy, bassy drums linger in the background. The Gleam Part 2 is a very percussive sounding track, with pounding marching drums played in tandem with pianos and even some very eclectic tropical steel drums being played at some points. This one pays homage to some story threads, some common themes and ideas that run throughout his discography, having to do with gleams and glows and such. What is the glow, you ask? Well, in the end it's up to your interpretation, but a common one is that the glow symbolizes the light contained within the prior relationship, and this album is about that glow having been extinguished. It's about coping with the fact that, as Phil sung in the title track, the glow is gone. I Want to Be Cold is a noise rock song, very different from everything else on the album thus far, although this won't be the last noise rock track. So if you're into noise, this should definitely satisfy you. It's very crunchy, with fast drum beats, crashing cymbals, ripping guitars that have been amplified and distorted so hard that the waveforms just show up as rectangles when you open this in Audacity. Also, Phil's ex-girlfriend can briefly be heard at the end, which I always found kind of funny for some reason. I Felt Your Shape is so addictive. This song has such a unique chord progression. This one deserved to be a single in my opinion. It's really catchy. Phil Elverum has described this song as being about hugging, and the difference between hugging someone tight and not letting them go, and hugging someone loosely so you can feel their shape in a way that's sensitive, whatever that means. Samurai Sword is another noise rock song. This time it's pretty much just noise, although if you're following the narrative of the album, the lyrics here are important. This song is about Phil stalking and attacking a bear, and the final song, My Warm Blood, serves as a mostly ambient outro, and thus the end of the record. It somewhat transitions into the next Microphones album, Mount Eerie, which is all about death. If you buy into the canon of the Glow Part 2, Phil dies at the end after being mauled by a bear, and the Mount Eerie album seems to be about the afterlife, or possibly a rebirth or reincarnation. This album honestly means too much to me to put into words. The relationship I've developed with The Glow Part 2 since I first heard it is like none other. I find lyrics getting stuck in my head as I cook eggs in the morning, when I think about my connection to nature, to other humans, to myself, to anything. It's formed an integral part of my thinking and identity, and has encouraged me to change my life on a number of occasions. There's a deeply personal component to this album. It seems to connect with people on an individual basis in a way that very little music out there can. It's just such an intimate, authentic, exceptionally unique record with so many good ideas. It's very creative and deep and conceptual. It feels like its own world you can lose yourself in. These are songs that I will never outgrow or get sick of. I've listened to this album probably 100 times over the years, and each time I come back to it, I take away something different from it. This time, I made a video about it. I hope you enjoyed it.